Hi there and welcome to this Innova UK's training video. In this third lecture we're going to go into more detail about the structural steel product CE marking, and we are basically going to see what is actually required of you in practice to CE mark a structural steel product, and also kind of like we're going to take the opposite look and see what is required of you to manufacture a steel product that is going to be CE marked. We have decided to divide this training into three parts. In the first part, we're going to take a quick flashback into the previous lectures, and I just want to highlight a few things there that are really important in terms of the CE marking of structural steel products. And in the second part, we're going to go over the key standards and see what kind of requirements we have there. And in the second part, we're going to focus quite a lot into the type of the requirements we have in the EN 1092 and also the ISO 38343. So in the second part, we're going to talk about the requirements in general and see what kind of requirements we have. In the third part, we are going to talk about the actual requirements in terms of the manufacturing and in terms of the FPC system, factory production control system, and what kind of documentation requirements we have there and what kind of procedure requirements we have there. So in this third part, we are going to see how to manufacture a structural steel product that is going to be CE marked. But before we get started, I would just like to highlight a few things in this first part. And the first thing is that if a characteristic is deemed to be an essential, so in other words, it's listed in the Appendix CA of the Halmana standard, it can only be declared as part of the CE marking, or you are not allowed to declare it at all. What this means is that here we have the structural steel products essential characteristics as defined in the Halmana standard EN 1091 Appendix CA. So tolerances on dimensions and shape, weldability, fracture toughness, durability, reaction to fire, load-bearing capacity, deformation at serviceability limit state, fatigue strength, resistance to fire, release of cadmium, radioactivity, manufacturing. And if you remember, these are the characteristics that are related to the manufacturing, and these are the characteristics that are related to the structural design. So if you want to communicate to your customer that, for example, what kind of structural steel you have used in the manufacturing, then it can be only done through the CE marking. So if you are not going to declare weldability as part of the CE marking, you are not allowed to communicate in any way to your customer what kind of steel you use to manufacture the structural steel product. Or if you have done anything in terms of corrosion protection, if you have wet painted it or if you have done hot dip galvanizing, whatever, you can only do that in part through the CE marking. So if you want to communicate to your customer what you have done in terms of corrosion protection or what kind of steel you have used or what kind of reaction to fire it has or how you have manufactured it, it can be only done through the CE marking. And without going too much into detail why, we usually or actually always have recommended to all of our customers to declare to always declare the manufacturing characteristics, and if they have included the structural design in the FPC system scope, and if the customer requires, then they can decide to declare these structural design characteristics. But always the manufacturing characteristics, too much, and sometimes the structural design characteristics. And the other thing I would like to mention here in the beginning is that even though in most construction products the scope of the FPC system is dictated in the Halmana standard, and in this case it would be the section 6.3 of EN 1091. But this is not the case in the structural steel products, but in addition you also must include the EN 1092 in terms of actual manufacturing, and if you do welding, you also must include the EN ISO 38343 for the welding. And only this is considered to be the adequate proof to back up your CE marking. So adequate proof to back up these characteristics that you are declaring. So I think that's enough about the preliminaries, and I think it's time to get cracking with the whole FPC system scope and the type of requirements we have in the relevant standards, mainly in the EN 1091, 1092, and 38343 for the welding. And without going too much into detail why and how and where, I'm just going to tell you that according to our experience, if you don't do any corrosion protection like wet painting, I would say that we have around 5% of the relevant requirements found in the EN 1091, which is actually the main standard or the harmonized standard. And then we have the EN 1092 that actually deals with the whole manufacturing process. It has the requirements and guidelines on how to perform mechanical fastening, holing, cutting, welding, and so on. So this one right here has somewhere around 85% of all the requirements. And then this EN ISO 38343, that is the welding quality management system, has about somewhere around 10% of the requirements, all the rest. And if you want to get some kind of idea on what kind of the requirements are in each and every one of these standards, I would say that these requirements are really easy. And if you really know what you're doing, you can achieve conformity with this standard in somewhere around 1 hour. Then we have the EN 1092, and this is the tricky one because it has quite a lot of different requirements involved. And I will say that if you don't do any welding, meeting the requirements of this standard is actually also quite easy. I would say that it would take somewhere around 2 to 3 days for you to achieve the conformity. But if you do welding, it's going to take a somewhat longer time because there are some mandatory requirements for the welder qualifications. You must have a responsible welding coordinator. You must perform welding according to the VPSs or welding procedure specifications. And all of those are going to take time. Not just your time, but in most cases you must involve a third party in the process, and then coordinating everything and getting the third party involved is going to take a lot of time. But still, if you know what you're doing, it can be done quite fast. Then we have the third place. I have just included this EN ISO 38343 here, just to elaborate it, that you must have a welding quality management system in place if you do welding, even though it's not that big part of the whole CE marking project. The reason behind that is that we have already covered most of the welding related requirements here in the EN 1092. Like that the welders must be qualified and welding must be performed according to the VPSs and so on. So the extra requirements that come from this standard comprise roughly around 10% of all the requirements that are related to the CE marking. But then, of course, if you do welding or corrosion protection, or even if you do measures on tolerances, there are some reference standards that must be followed. But I would say that unless you do corrosion protection with wet painting, hot dip galvanizing, you don't really have to consider the reference standards, as they are elaborating these things, but they are not really that much important things that the notified bodies are going to check. I would suggest, kind of like under the table suggestion, is that in your CE marking project you achieve conformity with these standards and with these reference standards if you do corrosion protection. But in the first phase you just achieve conformity with these standards, and then you get the CE marking certificate, or to be more precise, you get the certificate for your FPC system that has been built according to the requirements of EN 1091. And then after you have been certified, you start to go over these reference standards and kind of like see what is said in them, and if there is something important or something that relates to your activities, and then you include them. But I would say that in most cases, especially if you are a small or micro company, it's sufficient if you just achieve conformity with these key standards right here, and then get the welding related standards like welding related requirements like BPSs or responsible welding coordinator or welders qualifications from outside, so you don't actually have to read them yourself. But next I would like to just go over the topics that are covered in the EN 1091 and EN 1092, so you get a kind of like an idea of the contents of the standards. Unfortunately, due to the copyright issues, I'm not able to go over the standards in as much detail as I would like to go over them. So I'm just going to have to stay in quite general level of issues here, so we are not breaking any copyrights and we are not going to get sued or anything. But first, I just want to introduce you to the contents of the standards in the topic level. As you may remember from previous lectures, the FPC system is dictated in the standard EN 1091, and in this case with the structural steel products is in the section 6.3. And if you have the standard EN 1091, you can just check the section 6.3, and that is the scope of the FPC system, or the main factory production control system that must be supported then with the EN 1092 and EN ISO 38343. Well, in the standard section 6.3 is the main factory production control system. And it gives you some, or it gives out some requirements that you must control your personnel, equipment used in the manufacturing and also testing and weighing equipment. Then there are some requirements for the structural design process if you do structural design. And naturally, if you don't do any structural design, you can just skip this part. But if you do, you must consider it. Then there are some requirements for the constituent products that are used in the manufacture of structural steel products. Basically, this part just references another standard where there is a list of all the possible constituent products that can be used. Then there are some requirements for the development of the company specification, and basically who does what and how the company specification relates to other things. And then there are some requirements for the handling of non-conforming products. And at last there is the requirement for product evaluation. And this relates to the fact that this structural steel product falls in the group 2+. And if you remember what the requirements for the 2+ were, there is the manufacturer must establish an FPC system and then determine the essential characteristics in a thing called ITT or ITC, initial type testing, and then they must do spot checks during the manufacturing to make sure that the manufactured product meet the requirements of all the standards and also are according to those characteristics that you declare in the CE marking. So this part right here is the product evaluation of spot checks that are related to the AVCP class 2+. It can be thought, this product evaluation can be thought as the final inspection, even though it's not really quite that, but it kind of like makes it much easier if you just think about it as a final inspection that you make, in which you make sure that you have met all the relevant requirements, and usually we just take care of this product evaluation with a checklist. And then we have the standard EN 1092 that deals with the whole manufacturing process. And if we see this whole process right here, you can see it kind of like progresses as the manufacturing would progress. So first we have what listed all the constituent products that can be used, like what kind of structural steel or stainless steel we can use to manufacture structural steel products. Then we have how to handle those products, how to store them, how to identify them. Then we have the requirements for cutting, shaping, holding, cutouts, assembly, and not in the erection side because the CE marking only deals with the manufacturing done in the workshop. So all manufacturing and erection done at the erection site is excluded by definition from the CE marking. So at the erection site you can do whatever you want to. And all these requirements don't concern you there. But I just want to highlight is that assembly, if you do any trial assemblies at the workshop, they are included in the FPC system and in the scope of the EN1092. Then we have the welding, mechanical fastening, and surface treatment. And here we have kind of like the guidelines for each and every step of the manufacturing, and you must consider all of these in relation to your own activities. And like we saw already in the previous slide, if you don't do, let's say, any cutting, you can just ignore all of those requirements there and just skip over the whole section. And same thing for surface treatment, or if you don't do any welding, you just can skip all the welding related requirements. And here I would already like to mention one thing about these requirements is that not all of these steps are created equal in terms of the quantity of requirements there are. For example, if we take holing, there are only a few requirements that are related to the holing process. And if we compare it to, for example, to the requirements of welding, and in welding we have a huge list of different kind of requirements that take money and time and effort to comply with. With the holing requirements we can achieve conformity in, I would say, in one day. But with the welding it always takes a little bit longer because we have to involve a third party in the process. So we have quite a lot of different kind of requirements here that require, in most cases, an outside party. Like I said before, also these things are not created equal, so I want to just go into more detail about the EN1092 and EN1092 requirements, and I just want to talk about what kind of requirements we have there, so you kind of get this good idea of what kind of requirements you have to comply with. And as this is actually really beneficial if you have never seen a standard, or if you have never read standard, or if you have never received any training on how to read a standard. So it can be quite beneficial to understand what kind of requirements we are dealing with, and so it kind of like makes it easier for you to understand what we are talking about in the third or the last section of this training. And the first thing I would just like to mention here right in the beginning is that the standard requires you to do something, but it's really up to you to decide how you want to do it. So for example, we can have requirement that is related to the cutting, and the standard can say that the cutting must be performed with mechanical means. But it doesn't go into more detail on how you must perform the actual cutting process, or it doesn't deal with the specifics on how you must adjust the blade and so on. It just says that you must perform something in one way, or you must do something, but it's really up to you to decide how you want to do it. And if we take another example, for example, from the standard EN1091 that deals with the general FPC system, there's a requirement for the personnel that you must have a personnel listing that includes the relevant experience that the employees have. And this is a requirement that you must have a personnel listing, and then you must record the relevant experience and the expertise that is related to their work. So that is the requirement, but you can naturally achieve conformity with this requirement in 1001 ways. If you want to, nothing is preventing you from writing a personal listing behind an envelope with a pencil, and you just write all your employees there and their relevant experience, and that's it. You have achieved conformity with that requirement. But then again, if you want to use Excel spreadsheet, you're free to do that. If you want to use just a Word document, that's okay. If you want to use a notepad, nothing is preventing you. Or if you want to use some fancy ERP system, it's all right. You can use any mean you want to. There is no restrictions on the means, only restrictions on what you must do. And this also relates to the standard EN1092, that there are not step-by-step guides. They're just kind of like guidelines that you must follow in order to meet the requirements of the standard. And if I try to elaborate this point a little bit further, we can think about the EN1092 requirements as these boundaries that you cannot cross. Here I have represented the requirements for mechanical cutting that are represented in the EN1092 as these orange bars. So we kind of have these orange bars that create the boundaries for the company to perform mechanical cutting. So as long as the company works within those boundaries, they are able to meet the standards requirements. So the company doesn't have to perform the cutting in just on some single way. They can have quite a lot of variation. So technically one company then can do the mechanical cutting this way, and another one this way, and the third one can do it like this. And still each and every company, even though there's a huge variation between how each and every company performs the mechanical cutting, each and every company still meets the requirements for mechanical cutting that are presented in the standard EN 1092. What is funny is that the standards actually don't prescribe any continuous boundaries for a single manufacturing step. Instead, the requirements are kind of like sporadic in nature. So even though in the previous slide we have kind of like the requirements presented in this continuous manner, that there are kind of like requirements for each and every single step of the manufacturing process, like checking what the company specification says about the product that we are manufacturing, and then collecting the material from the previous step, and then adjusting the blade, and then whatever, and so on until the product is released to the next process. But this is not actually the case, but more accurate representation would be to describe these requirements or boundaries or guidelines as sporadic. So there are some requirements that deal with one aspect of the manufacturing, and then there are non-requirements for some, and then we have huge areas of the manufacturing that are not regulated in any way by the standards. So when the previous slide I presented that the company can work this way to meet the standard requirement, the fact is that there can be even more variation on how to perform each and every step. So the standards are really general guidelines on how to perform something. They are more like a listing of things that must be considered when manufacturing, especially with all the other requirements but welding. Conformity with the requirements can be achieved really fast, and it's mainly due to the fact that most likely you are already meeting the requirements of the EN 1092. There are some things that you must consider, and we're going to go over them in the next section, where you most likely don't have a conformity yet. Like you must qualify each and every holing process that you're using, or you must qualify thermal cutting, or so on. So we're going to go over those in the next section. And because the requirements are so general in nature, and they are more like guidelines, sporadic guidelines that are related to each and every manufacturing step, this is the reason why our pre-made FPC system, pre-made FPC documentation actually works. Because what we have done there is that we have taken all the requirements or mandatory requirements for each and every manufacturing step for mechanical cutting, holing, and so on. And what we have done there, we have summarized them into this really short description on how the work must be performed in order to meet the standard EN 1092 requirements. So even though we call the collection of these requirements that we have prepared working instructions, I would say that the proper word would be a summary of the EN 1092. And what we have done in the FPC system basically is that we have split out the whole EN 1092 into small pieces that are related to each and every manufacturing step. So we have a kind of like a working instruction on how to do holing and how to do mechanical cutting and so on. And these working instructions include these orange pieces of the EN 1092 in a simplified English. And we have also gone over the reference standards of EN 1092, so you have the whole package there. So you basically just have to read the working instructions that are dealing with each and every manufacturing step, and in most cases I think it's sufficient if you just read over the working instructions and see that you, and kind of like make sure that you already work in that way that is described in the working instructions. I think that's enough about the type of requirements we have in the EN 1092 and also in the EN 1091. That you must be able to prove to the notified body that you can follow the guidelines. Because the notified body is going to certificate your FPC system, and you must be able to prove to the notified body that you as a company have read the standards, or more precisely understand the requirements of the standards, and you are following them in your day-to-day activities. And it is usually not sufficient if you just describe that, okay, you describe to the notified body that, okay, we do storage in this way, and you just describe how you perform it, or you do holding in this way, and you go ahead and just describe it. Or if you remember from before, that there is some requirements for the structural design process, and there are requirements for the handling of non-conforming product. It's not sufficient if you just describe how you perform each and every step, but instead you must have some kind of documented procedures that you can show to the notified body, and then they can read it, and then they are going to believe you. So everything that is in black and white is believable, but if you have to describe it and you have to explain yourself, then it's usually the notified body is not going to believe you. So it's really up to you to set up the documented procedures with which you can prove that you are meeting the standard requirements of the notified body. And in most cases, and what we have noticed, and this kind of like comes from the ISO 9001 world, that you have in one way or another description of the work being carried out, and this must include the whole scope of the FPC system, so the EN 1091, EN 1092, and also the ISO 38343. So you describe each and every step that is included in your manufacturing system and that is prescribed in the or regulated in the standards. So you must have a description of the work being carried out that it relates to the structural design, that relates to the handling of non-conforming products, that deals with the identification storage of constituent products, that deals with the process of cutting, that deals with process of mechanical assembly, and so on. So you have a description of the work being carried out that has the same scope of the FPC system. The funny thing about the notified bodies is that they are not going to just believe you if you have documented the procedures. They want to kind of like see proof that you have performed the tasks that you are saying that you are performing. So if we take an example, you can have the inspection of incoming materials, where you say that, okay, we inspect all the incoming materials and then we store the inspection sheets. But the notified body is not going to believe you that you have actually checked and inspected all the incoming materials unless you have some proof of this. So from the inspection of incoming materials, you must have some kind of proof to show and document that proves to the notified body that you have performed the inspection of incoming materials as you have described in the description. So we have these work descriptions, and then we have the proof that is being made during the manufacturing and during each and every step. So you might have some document that proves that you have performed the review and verification of structural design, and you might have a document that proves to the notified body that you have actually checked the tolerances on dimensions and shape, and you have some document that proves to the notified body that the wet painting has been performed appropriately, and you have a document to prove to the notified body that you have qualified your thermal cutting procedures, and so on. So you must have the work descriptions, procedure descriptions, and then you must have the proof to back up your description of work.